Hi everyone, this is Laura Du. Welcome to my channel where I talk about what I wish I knew in my 20s in college about tech, startups, Silicon Valley, and life lessons along the way. So the next topic I want to cover is how do you land a dream job at a startup? And that has three components. One is how do you decide what kind of startup you want to join? Then how do you find that startup? And finally, how do you get that job? And I'll talk about all three of those potentially in separate videos. To start, how do you decide what kind of startup you want to join? For me, when I was starting my job search in 2015, I did a lot of reflection about what I was interested in. And ultimately, I married two frameworks for finding a startup job. The first was, what am I interested in? What are some of the industries or missions or topics I care about? That was a useful guiding thought for me, but there were still a lot of different industries I was potentially open to there. Number two was this Sheryl Sandberg framework of finding a rocket ship. This idea being, if you choose a startup that is growing really quickly, you will get so many career opportunities to take on different roles, to have real impact on a business that is serving customers with a product they actually want. And also you'll have the benefit of that startup on your resume, which, like we talked about in a previous video about the benefits of working in consulting or startups, that resume value can really help you get your foot in the door at future startups. To recap, I would really encourage you to first think about what are some industries or topics you're passionate about, whether that's wellness, sports, mental health, beauty, real estate, maybe your parents work in insurance or the restaurant industry. Whatever has touched your life in some way, that could be some interesting place for you to start. Not only because you might be intrinsically interested, but also you might have insights about that industry or that topic just from your personal experiences. And then number two, try to find a startup that has strong momentum, that is going to do well, because that way you're going to have opportunities to really challenge yourself, take on new responsibility, and have a really strong brand on your resume that future startups will look at and say, oh, she or he has relevant experiences working at a fast-growing, successful startup. In terms of finding startups that you might be interested in, there are three main sources I like to use for finding out about different startups. One, I subscribe to a ton of newsletters about startup funding news and just startup news in general. So a few sources that you might already know: TechCrunch, of course, is a big one. Crunchbase has a lot of funding news as well as other articles about interesting startups. Strictly VC is another one that would have fundraising updates and news from the VC world, but always talk about a few startups in each newsletter. And CB Insights is another one that covers not only startups and fundraising trends, but really trends at the industry and fundraising level. A second source is VC websites themselves. So you guys probably know some of the top name VCs, but Sequoia Capital, Benchmark, Andreessen Horowitz, Accel, Lightspeed, smaller seed funds that invest earlier stage like Floodgate, Cowboy Ventures, Forerunner for consumer companies, Emergence for enterprise software companies. These are all great sources of startups because these venture capitalists are trying to invest in the hottest startups all the time. Now, how do you figure out which investors to follow? Another source is the Forbes Midas list. That's MIDAS. I'll link all of these in the show notes. The Midas list profiles individual venture capitalists who have had really successful investments, and you can also look at what firms they work at and then go to the firm's websites and see the latest startups that they invested in as another source of interesting startups. Number three, there are lists of hot startups too. There's a list that was started many years ago called the Breakout List, which tries to publish interesting startups in a couple different categories, like fastest growing or mid-stage growing companies. Another list is the Wealthfront list, which is curated by a company called Wealthfront and profiles, again, large and interesting growing startups. There are a few smaller lists, like if you're very interested in enterprise SaaS, there's a VC firm called Wing VC, which actually publishes an enterprise tech list. So Lists are a good way of finding startups that other people think are interesting. And in the future, I'll try and curate some startups for you guys as well, so you can have that as a resource. Now, those lists, the VC websites, those are all great sources of finding interesting startups and understanding what different startups do. But how do you really know if a startup is doing well and is going to provide you that kind of growth trajectory for your career as well as for the company that could lead to financial upside? That is, of course, the million-dollar question, billion-dollar question really, that VCs are trying to answer. However, I think a few tips I would highlight are, again, look at who their investors are, because these investors are making a living by trying to choose breakout startups. Number two, look for people that are really talented that you want to work with. Searching on LinkedIn and kind of see where different employees have worked in the past. You can look at the founders' backgrounds and what they have done in the past. Finally, you can try to assess for yourself, is this startup in a large and interesting market? Because that is a great sign. How did I find Opendoor and decide to work there? Hey guys, while editing I realized that there's so much more to cover on this topic of how to choose a startup, so I'm actually going to record a separate video on it and cut this one as how to find different startups and discover interesting startups. And so next episode I will talk about how to evaluate a startup you're considering joining, how I chose and found Opendoor in detail, and I hope you guys will like, subscribe, comment as usual, and I will see you guys next week. Bye!